Hi everybody, welcome to the first lecture on game design theory. We're going to continue where we left off with the last video. We're just talking about the three-level model of game design, which was mechanics and systems on the material end, then gameplay itself, and then player experience as the result of players interacting with the game mechanics and rules and experiencing what it feels like to play the game. And as mentioned before, we're going to start from this player experience aspect first. So, what is the player experience? We said at the very beginning that we want to give the player a kind of an experience. And the most obvious way of talking about it is to just talk about fun, right? A lot of reviews, a lot of just general the way the players talk about games concentrates on fun, right? Like, are you having fun playing this game? Because if you're not, why are you playing it? And it's it's an interesting word because it communicates a lot. The difficulty for us is that it's not a precise word. So it's not going to be very helpful for us because fun means different kinds of things for different kinds of people, right? If somebody's having fun, they might be having they may be experiencing the joy of competition, the joy of competing with other people, of having a very adrenaline and action-oriented kind of a game, or they could be having fun by sitting down in front of chess and just sitting there and thinking about it, right? Like, these are very different kinds of fun, but they're both valid. And what's more, people have very different experiences of what is fun for them. So as I mentioned before, instead of using a vague word like fun, and then try to kind of figure out what that means, let's switch our vocabulary a little bit to figure out what do we mean by we're having fun? What are the exact things that we're talking about when we say we're having fun or a player is having fun? So here's a way to make this a little bit more concrete. Consider your own favorite games. Pick a game that you like to play, that you come back to over and over, and consider what makes it fun for you. What is it about it that makes you come back to it? And also, is this a game that maybe other people will also find fun? Or maybe more interestingly, do you have friends who do not like this game, do not find it fun in the same way? That's kind of interesting because the way that people react to games is very personal. Some people will find some kinds of activities interesting, some kinds of themes interesting. And in this class, since we're focusing on gameplay, we're going to be looking mainly at what do players do in games that they're enjoying. And we're going to switch to the word enjoying rather than fun as we look through the following examples. I'm going to introduce the idea that what players are enjoying is that games satisfy some kind of a desire or some kind of a motivation for them, right? Some players are motivated in different ways, as we all are, and games that address this motivation will be fun for them. So what do we mean more precisely? Well, let's look at a bunch of examples. One way in which games are often fun is by providing a challenge. This is something that is common to all sorts of games, from the early arcade classics all the way until modern times. Games can be fun because they provide us with challenges to overcome, with obstacles. And it's fun to figure out a way to overcome them and sort of see yourself get better and improve yourself. Related to this, but slightly different, is when games are fun because they provide an adrenaline rush of action, whether it doesn't have to be racing necessarily, it can be combat games, action games. There's something very interesting about just like being in the middle of action and doing stuff. On the diametrically opposite end of this, some games are fun because they provide an opportunity to figure things out and learn about the world and learn how to control it. This can be very fun, for example, in simulation and strategy games, to figure out just exactly how the game works so that you can get it to do what you want it to do. Somewhat related to this is when games are fun because they let us explore worlds, right? From the classic sandbox games like Minecraft or roguelikes, which provide us with procedurally generated worlds which have never been seen before, to games, like strategy games or open world sandbox games. There's a lot of opportunity to explore new things and just lose yourself in the world. Uh, Similarly, games that give us an opportunity to become somebody else. This can be interesting and fun to just walk in somebody else's shoes for a while and see what it's like to be them in the world that they're in. And related to this is games that let us experience a story, empathize with characters, have a cathartic experience of overcoming somebody else's of being part of somebody else dealing with challenges that they're dealing with. And in games, this can be extra powerful when we can change the trajectory of the world, when we're not observers of a predestined trajectory. On a slightly more physical level, games can be fun because they're scary, because they're disgusting, because they're nasty and ugly looking, etc. There's something very primeval about horror films and horror games and similar kinds of things where you're just reacting to this negatively, and that's kind of interesting. Or on the diametrically opposite end of this, games that are cute and humorous and fun, and you're just like enjoying the stories and the plots and the situations that you're watching. This can be a very powerful motivator in games. Sometimes we play games just to feel that sort of like joy, right? Just of being in a nice place, and that is full of interesting characters and is sort of aesthetically a cool environment to be in. Related to this, sometimes we play games and enjoy them because they let us create things and they let us express ourselves. Whether it's through Minecraft being a good example of sort of sandbox games that let us build things, or games like Sims that let us sort of be other people and sort of role play as somebody else. Role playing games are also a good example of that. And sometimes games are fun just for the pure aesthetic pleasure of just giving us a beautiful world in which we are. That is completely. That is a very common thing for games to do as well, because it is an audiovisual medium and the sensory experience is incredibly important. And sometimes games are fun because they're just a pastime, right? It is something that you know what to do. You can play them very easily with with your eyes closed, as it were. And it doesn't have to be solitaire, right? It doesn't have to be a card game. It can be Civilization, right? If you've played Civilization for years and years and years, it becomes a pastime in such a way that it's, even though it's no longer a challenge, there's something very pleasurable about coming back into a rule set that you know. But one thing that's important about all of these elements is that these motivations and the way that games satisfy them are really context specific. They depend on the player. Some players will like the adrenaline rush of racing games. Some players will like to sit down in front of a chessboard and think for a little bit. Some players will like to build, and other players will like to explore existing worlds, and so on. Different people like different kinds of things. Different people will like different. So sorry, let me rephrase this. The same person might enjoy different kinds of things at different points in the day, in their life, and so on. Different people will look at the same game design elements and react to them differently. So a racing, adrenaline-packed game will be appealing to some, but not to others. Basically, there is no objective maximum in game design towards which we should strive. What is good for some people is not going to be fun for others, because as we said before, games satisfy their motivations, their agency, and people have different motivations and different modes of agency. And some games will speak to them, and other games will not. So, even though it's good to know why I enjoy some games or why some particular players enjoy some games, we would benefit from having a little bit more generalization in here, a little bit of a more broader theory about what entire classes, entire groups of players enjoy. In order to design games, we would like to make games for a number of players, for as many players as possible, and it would be beneficial for us to know how maybe an entire group of players will react to something. Does this satisfy a number of different motivations, for example? So, for that, we can look at what are called player theories. So, these are theories of what motivates or what drives entire sets of players together. We will look at a number of historical theories first, and then we will take a look at some of cutting edge work that combines the motivations that we discussed a moment ago with empirical research based on how people report actually playing games. So, in terms of historical player theories, probably the best known one is Richard Bartle's mud player types model, which was created in the context of multiplayer text-based games, so-called MUDs, and it divides players into four categories: killers, achievers, socializers, and explorers. It was one of the very first player models in trying to organize player types by motivation, not just activity. And it's very interesting in that even though it was made specifically for that particular set of games at that particular type, it is kind of broad enough that you will see it referenced to this day and used by people because there is something complementary about these categories. Some people like to look at self-determination theory and other theories from psychology in talking about players. The idea being that we should look at players as agents in the world and look at what motivates them as people, as agents to interact and to get things done in the world. This becomes very similar to theories of motivation in real life, so issues of autonomy and competence and relatedness in the self-determination theory become the driving forces. This is not used very much in game design because it is not specific enough, but it's an interesting way to look at gameplay. Another thing that people sometimes will reference is psychology and personality models. So the biggest one is the ocean model, or so-called five-factor model, which is very interesting because it is empirically based and it divides personalities into clusters based on where they are on five different axes. So one axis is openness to experience versus cautiousness. Another axis is somebody being conscientious versus maybe not caring so much, extroversion versus introversion, and so on. And player personality types are a very interesting thing because you can almost see how they would map to gameplay. And as we will see in a few more slides, it does a little bit. But as such, just purely as a psychological model, it doesn't get used in game design directly. What does get used in game design, or maybe I should say in game production, is something called user stories. Now, this is not a player model as such. It does not explain why people do certain things inside the game, what motivates them. It's more of a way to look at players as people who buy games and what is interesting to them as players of games, not players of this particular game. This is more useful as a marketing tool, not a design tool. But we should talk about this anyway because it does show up frequently. The idea behind the marketing user story is that you either do user studies, so for example, surveys or focus groups with existing players, or sometimes you can get by just analyzing what you know about the players that you know. And what you're trying to come up with is very stereotyped sort of archetypes of who are your players and what are they like. So in this example, we might consider John, who is a young professional or maybe a recent graduate. He works full time. He plays games in the evening after work with his friends. He doesn't have time to play games very much, but when he does, it's a way to reconnect with his friends and he tends to play adrenaline-filled action games. This is a very crude image, right? Like this is a very simplified kind of a vision of what somebody would do, very intentionally so, right? This is not supposed to be an interesting psychological study, but what it's trying to be is a kind of an idea pump to get players to get creators to imagine what role do the games play in their lives, and from that to drive both marketing so that we know who to address marketing at, and also to imagine what kind of a role the game will, what kind of a slot will the game fit into in their lives, so that we don't make assumptions about the player that are unfounded. So, for example, if we're making a game for young professionals who play the game after work, these are going to be games that can be played for an hour or two. We probably should not be making a game that's being played for 5 minutes on your cell phone, right? They're not going to be interested in that. At the same time, we should not be making an MMO that requires 4-hour raids on a weekend, right? Because that's not going to fit into their time schedule, and so on and so forth. You can, by seeing how the game fits into somebody's real life, you can compare that against the design and see if there are any obvious problems or if the design reinforces the archetype. But these are very kind of crude tools. These kinds of user stories do not really get used in design as such very often, more in product validation and marketing. What we are starting to see being used in game design is player motivation types. So this is fairly recent work done by, for example, Nikki, and there are also other player motivation theories that you can read about in the book. The idea being that we look at what motivates players and what they report motivates them, and try to cluster them into sort of consistent groups. So, for example, Nikki has this very cool taxonomy of 12 different player motivations, kind of split into 6 categories for convenience. So imagine player motivations such as a desire for destruction, right? So somebody who plays games that are full of chaos and mayhem and things blowing up, like that. All right, that's an interesting motivation. Excitement is right there alongside that. But right next to it is the desire for strategy, right? Thinking ahead, making decisions. It's a very different desire. It's a very different kind of a game that's gonna come out of people seeking that kind of a gameplay. Other things don't have to have anything to do with challenge or strategy, but things like story or design. Like building a world where you express yourself is a completely valid and common kind of a player motivation, and so on and so forth. These 12 are sourced from a variety of places, including previous writing on game design and a number of different designers' theories. So what the study author did was ask a very large number of players to rate themselves along these different 12 dimensions to find out if any of these motivations cluster, and if we can pull out any kind of player profiles out of this. So the surveys would ask a number of questions that try to give them scores along these 12 different dimensions. And then the study did an attempt at correlating them to see if there are co-occurrences of motivations. For example, do people who score high on completion, will they say they also are motivated by power? Maybe they're motivated by fantasy. Maybe they're motivated by design. Are there correlations between these 12 different dimensions? And the results were interesting. Here is a 2D plot of co-occurrence, flattened so that distance on this 2D plot represents co-occurrence, so that if 2 points are closer to each other, they tend to co-occur more often. And we can see kind of clusters emerging here. Apparently, it shows that people who scored high on being motivated by strategy also tend to score high on being motivated by completion or by challenge. Somewhat by power, they don't tend to be highly correlated with people motivated by destruction, for example, or excitement. So there's one cluster in the upper right, the sort of completion strategy cluster. In the lower right, there's a cluster of motivations of community and excitement and competition and destruction being much more closely correlated than, let's say, excitement and completion. And then in the lower left, we can see what we call a story fantasy cluster, which suggests that players who are motivated by story tend to be also motivated by design elements, by fantasy, somewhat by discovery, maybe somewhat by further out things like strategy and power. They tend to not to be motivated by challenge or competition. Intuitively, this makes sense, right? This is something that if you told me the results, I would nod my head and say, okay, that actually kind of matches my experience. But it's very interesting that this came out of user surveys and trying to figure out how people rate themselves, and then only coming out of the survey with correlations instead of trying to imagine them a priori. The study then goes further, and by asking the same survey takers to take a personality test, it tries to find correlations between these clusters and personality types. And very interestingly, the study finds very weak but existing correlations between 3 of the big 5 personality profiles and some of those clusters, specifically a weak correlation between conscientiousness and reporting being motivated by strategy and completion and challenge. A correlation between openness to experience and being motivated by story and design and fantasy, and correlation between extroversion and being motivated by destruction and community and competition. These are, again, things that seem incredibly intuitive, but it's fascinating to see them coming out of empirical out of empirical data as opposed to a priori models. So one thing that is one way in which this is immediately useful to us as designers is in trying to figure out how a game that we're analyzing or a game that we want to make fits into these correlations. So, for example, we can look at a number of games and see where do they fit into this, and how does this work for them. For example, first-person shooters like Counter-Strike might fulfill desire for challenge, strategy, competition, probably not for fantasy or design, which puts them squarely in the lower right corner. A game like Final Fantasy tends to be a little harder to fit. It might fulfill desires for challenge, but also story, and also fantasy, and also discovery. It is kind of like a broader, larger kind of a game that fits in many places. On the other hand, something like The Sims, for example, is going to be more narrowly focused on the story, design, and fantasy aspects. There is a little bit of strategy and destruction, but those are not primary elements of the game by any stretch of imagination. So it's interesting to look at the games through the lens of this model in a couple of different ways. One, to see what is the kind of coverage that the game has over different motivation types, to see if it, for example, targets a specific cluster of motivations, or if it's trying to be a very broad game. And two, also to see if it's trying to address motivations that are unrelated or maybe even counter-related to each other. For example, a game that's trying to do both satisfy the design and fantasy aspects and also challenge and excitement aspects might not do so well if these motivations are not correlated. We might find that we're making a game that tries to satisfy two different types of players and in the end satisfies neither. So we can use these kinds of player motivation clusters and player motivation correlations as a guide of sorts, right? It lets us understand what players are motivated by and also what else would they be motivated by in addition to what we already have thought about. The authors of the study also produced a number of other data graphs and findings from this data set, which are just very interesting. I would encourage you to check out the studies yourself from Quantic Foundry. I'm just going to bring up two graphs which are kind of interesting. This is the graph of people's response to the competition motivation as a function of age. And it's very interesting to see the shape of these curves. It's kind of common knowledge that the young people are more motivated by competition than people, a decade or two older than they are. But just the slope of these curves is very interesting. Young people are much more motivated by competition, but by the time responders reach the age of, say, 35 or 40, those slopes become fairly flat, and people no longer respond very much to competition at all. This is very interesting. If you're making a game about competition, it tells you what you need to know about the player demographics and vice versa. Speaking of which, here's a graph of how people respond to the strategy motivation as a function of age and a function of gender. And again, very interesting because we see a very different profile curve. Again, slightly higher towards the younger age group, but not really that much, right? The gap here tends to be much more between genders than between age groups. So again, this tells you something about if you're making a game specifically about a specific motivation or specifically for specific player demographics, whether there's going to be a match or not. And there are, of course, limitations to these kinds of studies. There are questions about self-selection of respondees. There are questions about bias in the data. So there's a number of questions that could be asked about this, and I'm sure we will be getting much more updated data as these studies continue. But it is very interesting to see correlations between motivations and age, correlations between motivations and gender, and both. And I think this is a very good beginning of an empirical and evidence-based studies of how player expectations and player motivations interact with game design. So to summarize, what we're looking out of player experience is understanding why players have fun, but not talking about fun in the sort of like generic ebullient sense of enjoying themselves, but more specifically, why are players enjoying themselves? What is it that speaks to them? And in the process of trying to figure that out, we've introduced the idea of different players having different motivations, responding to different things about the game, how the game gives them different abilities, different agency. And as much as possible, we would like this to be motivated by empirical research and knowing how players actually interact with games out there in the world. And we have seen that there are very interesting recent studies of how that happens and how some of these motivations can cluster together and some of these motivations can work with each other or against each other. This is a very interesting model that we can use to figure out when we're trying to create an experience for the player, what kind of motivations is going to satisfy, what kind of motivations is going to address, and what kind of an experience the player is going to have. And that's that for lecture number 1. Next time we're going to start from the other side of this model, which is mechanics and systems. And we're going to look at the material elements of game design, and in lecture number 3, we'll bring it all together. Alright, see you then.